This story takes place in the fall of 1946, just over a year after World War II ended. I was 23 years old, recently discharged from the Army, working as a security guard at a remote supply depot in the Pacific Northwest. What happened during those night shifts changed everything I thought I knew about loyalty, friendship, and the bonds that survive even beyond this life. The war had been over for 15 months, but America was still dealing with the aftermath. Thousands of soldiers were returning home, trying to fit back into civilian life. I was one of them. After 3 years overseas, I took the first job I could find: night security at a military supply depot about 30 miles outside Seattle. The facility was being decommissioned. Mountains of surplus equipment, vehicles, supplies, everything the Army didn't need anymore. Our job was simple: patrol the grounds, make sure nobody was stealing government property, and file reports every morning. There were 3 of us on the night shift. Me, a guy named Frank Robertson, ex-Marine, quiet, kept to himself, and Tommy Chen, whose family had just been released from one of the internment camps. Tommy didn't talk much about those years. None of us did. We all had things we were trying to forget. We worked 4 nights a week, 8 p.m. to 6 a.m. The depot covered about 40 acres, mostly flat ground with rows of storage buildings and a thick forest on the western edge. During our shifts, we'd take turns patrolling different sections, rotating every 2 hours to stay alert. It was October 15th, 1946. I remember the date because it was exactly 1 year since my unit had shipped home from the Pacific, when we first noticed something strange. I was on the eastern perimeter around midnight when I heard Frank's voice crackle over the radio. "You guys see that?" "See what?" Tommy responded. "Fourth guard, walking the north fence line." I stopped walking. "Frank, there's only 3 of us tonight." Static silence.
Then, "I'm looking at 4 people right now. 3 of us, and someone else. Tall guy. Looks like he's wearing an old uniform." Tommy and I converged on Frank's position. When we got there, he was standing perfectly still, staring at the fence line about 200 yards away. "Where?" I asked. He pointed. "Right there. You don't see him?" I saw nothing. Just empty ground and chain-link fence stretching into the darkness. "Frank, there's nobody there." "I'm telling you, I just watched him walk the entire fence line. He had a flashlight. I saw it clear as day." We searched the area. No footprints, no signs anyone had been there. Frank insisted he'd seen someone, but Tommy and I found nothing. We filed it as a possible intruder sighting and continued our shift. The next night it happened again. This time Tommy saw him. "Fourth guard on the south warehouse," Tommy radioed at 1 a.m. "Somebody's checking the doors." Frank and I rushed over. Again, nothing, but Tommy was adamant. He'd watched a figure in what looked like military fatigues methodically checking each door on the warehouse, exactly like we did during our patrols. "Maybe it's a former worker," I suggested. "Someone who used to work here, still making rounds out of habit?" "At 1 in the morning?" Frank shook his head. "And how'd he get past the main gate?" The third night I saw him myself. I was walking between 2 storage buildings, my flashlight cutting through the October mist, when I caught movement in my peripheral vision. I turned, and there he was, maybe 50 feet away, walking parallel to me. He was tall, wearing what looked like an army uniform from the early war years. I couldn't see his face clearly in the darkness, but something about his posture, the way he moved, felt familiar. "Hey!" I called out. "This is a restricted area." He didn't stop, didn't even turn around, just kept walking at the same steady pace. I ran after him, but when I rounded the corner of the building, he was gone, vanished. I searched for 10 minutes, nothing. When we met up at the guard shack for our 2 a.m. break, all 3 of us were shaken. We'd each seen him now. Same description, tall, military uniform, moving like he was on patrol. "We should report this," Tommy said.
And say what? Frank lit a cigarette with shaking hands. That we're seeing ghosts? They'll fire us, or worse, send us for psychiatric evaluation. We decided to keep it between us, but we also decided to do something else. The next night, all three of us would patrol together. No more splitting up. Whatever this was, we'd face it as a team. That fourth night, October 19th, everything changed. All three of us were walking the north perimeter around 11 p.m. when we saw him. This time, he was standing still, about 100 yards away, right at the edge of the tree line where the depot grounds met the forest. He was facing us. For the first time, I could see him clearly in the moonlight. The uniform was definitely U.S. Army, but older style, early 1940s issue. And something about his stance, the way he held himself. "Do you guys recognize him?" I whispered. Frank's voice was barely audible. "Yeah, I think I do." The figure raised one hand slowly and pointed toward the forest. Then he turned and walked into the trees. "Should we follow?" Tommy asked. Every instinct told me no, but something stronger pulled me forward. "Stay together. Nobody splits off." We entered the forest. The forest was dense, darker than the open depot grounds. Our flashlights carved narrow paths through the trees as we followed where the figure had pointed. Frank led the way, Tommy stayed in the middle, and I brought up the rear. "This doesn't feel right," Tommy whispered. "We should go back, call the police." "And tell them what?" Frank said. "That we're chasing a ghost into the woods?" We'd been walking for maybe 10 minutes when Frank stopped abruptly. "You guys smell that?" I did. Something stale and wrong. Not exactly decay, but close, like earth that had been disturbed and left to settle. "There," Frank pointed his flashlight to the left. "Look!" The ground was different there, sunken slightly, overgrown with moss but clearly disturbed at some point. And at the edge of the depression, barely visible in the leaf litter, was something that made my heart stop. A piece of fabric, faded olive drab, military issue. "We need to dig," I said quietly. "Are you crazy?" Tommy backed away. "If there's something buried here, this is a police matter." "Just a little," I insisted. "Just enough to see." Frank was already on his knees, clearing away leaves with his hands. I joined him. Tommy stood watch, his flashlight shaking slightly. We didn't have to dig deep. 6 inches down, Frank's hand hit something solid. He brushed away more dirt, revealing metal. Dog tags. Frank lifted them carefully, wiped off the mud. In the beam of my flashlight, we read the name stamped into the metal. James R. Morrison, U.S. Army. Below the name was a serial number and blood type, standard issue identification tags. But what made us all go silent was the date. These tags were from 1943. "Morrison," Frank said slowly. "Jimmy Morrison. He was in my unit. We served together in Italy." His voice cracked. "He went missing in action during the Anzio campaign. January 1944. They never found his body." I looked at him. "Frank, what was Jimmy doing here, in Washington State? He shouldn't be here. He disappeared in Italy. The Army declared him killed in action." Frank was shaking now. "But if these are his tags, then he made it home," Tommy finished. "Somehow he made it back to the States." We stood there in the dark forest, trying to make sense of it. If Jimmy Morrison had survived the war, if he'd made it back to America, why was he buried in an unmarked grave in the woods behind a supply depot? "We keep digging," I said, "carefully. We need to know."
It took us 2 hours, working in shifts, moving soil with our hands to preserve whatever evidence might be there. And what we found told a story that made my blood run cold. James Morrison's remains were buried in a shallow grave, still wearing the remnants of a U.S. Army uniform. But this wasn't a combat uniform. This was a dress uniform, the kind soldiers wore stateside. And lying next to the remains was something else. A leather wallet, remarkably preserved by the Pacific Northwest's wet soil. Inside the wallet, we found a train ticket. Seattle to San Francisco, dated November 1945. A discharge paper showing Morrison had been released from service in October 1945. And a photograph, Morrison with his arm around a young woman, both smiling at the camera. "He made it home," Frank whispered. "He survived the war, got discharged. He was going home." "But he never made it," Tommy said. The pieces were falling into place, but the picture they formed was dark. Morrison had been here, at this depot, in late 1945, right after the war ended. The facility would have been busy then, processing returning soldiers, handling equipment. Thousands of people coming and going. And somewhere in that chaos, James Morrison had ended his life. Or someone had ended it for him. "We need to call the police," Tommy said firmly. "Right now. This is a crime scene." But Frank was staring back toward the depot, toward the path we'd walked. "He's been trying to show us. For 4 nights. Walking his patrol, trying to lead someone here." He wanted to be found, I realized. After all these years, he wanted his family to know what happened to him. We marked the location and hiked back to the guard shack. Frank called the county sheriff while Tommy and I documented everything we'd seen, every detail of the past 4 nights. The sheriff arrived with 2 deputies at 3 a.m. We led them to the site. By dawn, the entire area was cordoned off as a crime scene. Military investigators were called in. The Army wanted to know how one of their discharged soldiers had ended up buried in the woods behind their supply depot. The investigation took 3 weeks. What they discovered was both tragic and, in a strange way, a relief. The military investigation concluded in early November 1946. What they discovered painted a picture that was both clearer and more heartbreaking than any of us had imagined. Captain Wesley from Army Intelligence called the 3 of us into his temporary office at the depot. He had a file folder in front of him, thick with documents and photographs. "Gentlemen, I want to thank you for your cooperation," he began. "What you found in those woods has answered questions that have troubled several families for over a year." He opened the folder and pulled out a photograph. It was the same one we'd found in Morrison's wallet, Jimmy with his arm around a young woman. James Morrison was discharged from service on October 12, 1945, right here at this depot. He'd served with distinction in Italy, been wounded twice, earned a Purple Heart and a Bronze Star. By all accounts, he was eager to get home to his fiancée in San Francisco. Frank leaned forward. "So what happened? Why didn't he make it?" Captain Wesley's expression darkened. He did make it, or rather, he tried to. Morrison caught a train south on October 14th, but something brought him back here 3 days later. He pulled out another document, a logbook from the depot's main gate, dated October 17th, 1945. The gate guard recorded Morrison's return at approximately 9 p.m. He was asking about another soldier, a private named Robert Chen. Tommy went rigid beside me. "Chen? That's my family name. Your brother, actually," Captain Wesley said gently. "Robert Chen was processed through this depot the same day as Morrison. Your brother had just been released from the internment camp at Minidoka. He was trying to re-enlist, to prove his loyalty to the country that had imprisoned his family." Tommy's voice was barely a whisper.
Bobby never came home. My parents thought he'd run away. Couldn't face us after we'd been in the camps while he served overseas. He didn't run away, Captain Wesley said. According to what we've pieced together from various sources, there was an incident that night. A group of former soldiers, men who'd served in the Pacific Theater, confronted your brother in one of the storage buildings. There were words exchanged. Things got heated. My stomach dropped. I knew where this was going. Morrison witnessed it. He tried to intervene. There was a confrontation. In the chaos, Captain Wesley paused. Both Morrison and your brother ended their lives that night. The men responsible panicked. They buried both bodies in the woods, destroyed the paperwork, and scattered. Most of them have since left the area, but we're tracking them down. The room was silent. Tommy had tears streaming down his face. We found your brother yesterday, Captain Wesley continued softly, about 50 yards from where Morrison was buried. He was still wearing his uniform. We're working to notify your family properly. Tommy stood abruptly and walked out. Frank and I let him go. Some grief needs space. Why? Frank asked. Why did this happen? The war was over. We'd won. These men had survived everything, and them? Hate doesn't end just because wars do, Captain Wesley said. Some men came home from the Pacific with deep anger. When they saw someone of Japanese descent trying to enlist, wearing the same uniform they'd worn, he shook his head. It's not an excuse. It's barely an explanation. But it's what happened. Over the following days, more details emerged. Morrison had been walking back to the train station after trying to help Robert Chen when he was attacked. He'd fought back, trying to protect someone he'd never even met before that night.
Both men had paid the ultimate price for standing up against injustice. The depot investigation revealed that the incident had been covered up by a corrupt supply sergeant who had been part of the group. He'd falsified records, buried the evidence, and transferred out within weeks. The Army was now pursuing charges against everyone involved. But none of that brought Morrison or Robert Chen back. A week after the discovery, Tommy returned to work. His eyes were red, but his voice was steady. "My parents want to thank you both," he said, "for finding Bobby, for giving them closure. They're planning a proper burial." "Morrison's family too," Frank added. "I spoke with his fiancée. She never married, spent a year waiting for him, then spent the rest of her life wondering what happened. Now she knows." That night, our last shift before the depot officially closed, something extraordinary happened. We were making our final patrol around midnight when we saw them. Not one figure this time, but two. James Morrison and Robert Chen, standing side by side at the edge of the tree line, exactly where Morrison had first appeared to us. This time they weren't pointing. They were facing us, and even at a distance, I could see they were smiling. Frank raised his hand in salute. Tommy and I did the same. The two figures returned the salute. Then they turned and walked into the forest together. And this time, they didn't look back. We never saw them again. The depot closed officially on November 30th, 1946. Frank, Tommy, and I were among the last employees to leave. But before we went our separate ways, we made a promise to attend both funerals and to tell the real story whenever we could. James Morrison's service was held on a cold December morning in a small town outside Sacramento. His fiancée, Margaret, was there, a woman in her mid-20s who looked like she'd aged a decade in the year she'd spent waiting and wondering. Frank approached her after the service.
I stood nearby and heard their conversation. "I served with Jimmy in Italy," Frank said quietly. "He saved my life twice. Once at Anzio, once at Monte Cassino. He was the best soldier I ever knew. But more than that, he was the best person." Margaret's eyes filled with tears. "Tell me about him, please. I only had him for 2 years before he enlisted. I want to know who he became over there." So Frank told her. About Jimmy's courage under fire. About how he'd share his rations with Italian children they'd encounter in bombed-out villages. About the time Jimmy had risked a court-martial to rescue a wounded German soldier because, as he'd said, the war's between governments, not between men. "That sounds like him," Margaret whispered. "Always seeing the humanity in everyone." "That's why he tried to help Robert Chen," Frank continued. "He didn't know him anything. But he saw a fellow soldier being attacked for no reason other than hate, and he couldn't walk away." Margaret looked at the casket. "At least he died being exactly who he was. That gives me some peace." Robert Chen's funeral was different. It was held at a Buddhist temple in Seattle, and the grief there was compounded by years of injustice. Tommy's parents had already lost their home, their business, and 2 years of their lives to the internment camps. Now they'd lost their son. But when Tommy told them how Robert died, standing his ground, defended by a stranger who became a brother in those final moments, something shifted in his father's expression. "He died with honor," Mr. Chen said in halting English. "Not running, not hiding, standing." "Yes, sir," I said, and James Morrison made sure he didn't stand alone. The story spread through the Japanese-American community. Within weeks, the families had raised money for a memorial. Not just for Robert Chen, but for both men. A simple stone marker was placed at the edge of the forest where they'd been found, with both names and a single inscription: "Brothers in arms, brothers in sacrifice. They stood together." In January 1947, the Army concluded its investigation. 3 men were charged with manslaughter. The supply sergeant who'd covered it up received a dishonorable discharge and prison time. It wasn't enough, could never be enough, but it was something. Frank received a letter from Margaret in February. She'd enclosed a photograph, the same one we'd found in the wallet, but this was the original, crisp and clear. On the back, she'd written, "Thank you for bringing him home. Thank you for making sure he wasn't forgotten. He would have been proud to know you. Margaret." Frank kept that photo on his mantle for the rest of his life. But the story doesn't end with the funerals and the investigation. Because what we experienced in those October nights in 1946 changed how all 3 of us understood the world. Tommy went on to become a social worker, helping other Japanese-American families rebuild their lives after the camps. He said Robert's story and Morrison's sacrifice showed him that bridges could be built even across the deepest divides. Frank became a teacher. He taught history at a high school in Oregon, and every year on the anniversary of that night, he'd tell his students about 2 soldiers who proved that courage isn't just what you do in war. It's what you do for strangers when no one's watching. As for me, I kept working security for another 30 years. And in all that time, I never once dismissed a strange sighting or an unexplained occurrence. Because I'd learned that sometimes the impossible is just the truth waiting to be discovered. I've thought a lot about why Morrison appeared to us specifically. Why not the day shift guards? Why not earlier? Why those 4 nights in October? I think it's because he needed people who would understand. 3 veterans who'd seen enough of the world to know that death doesn't always mean the end. 3 men who'd lost enough that we recognized loss in others. 3 people who wouldn't run when confronted with the unexplainable. Morrison walked those depot grounds for a year, maintaining his post, keeping his eternal watch. But he wasn't haunting the place. He was protecting it, making sure that when the time was right, when the right people were there, the truth would finally come to light. After the funerals and the investigation, I thought the story was over. But in the months that followed, I learned that what we'd experienced was just the beginning of something much larger. In March 1947, I received a letter from a woman named Dorothy Sullivan. She'd been a clerk at the depot from 1943 to 1945, working in the processing office where soldiers received their discharge papers. She wrote, "I read about the discovery in the newspapers. I need to tell you something I've kept secret for 2 years. I think I was the last person to see James Morrison alive. I drove to Portland to meet her. She was in her early 30s, nervous, twisting a handkerchief in her hands as she told me her story. It was October 17, 1945, around 8 p.m., she began. I was working late, finishing up discharge paperwork. Morrison came into the office, very agitated. He said he'd witnessed something terrible happening in Building 7, one of the old storage warehouses. What did you do? I told him to report it to the MPs, but he said there was no time, that he needed help immediately. He asked if I knew where he could find the duty officer. Dorothy's voice trembled. I gave him directions to the security office. That was the last time I saw him. Why didn't you come forward when he went missing? She looked down. Because the next morning my supervisor told me Morrison had never been here, that there was no record of him returning to the depot. He showed me the gate log. Morrison's name had been erased. My supervisor said I must have been mistaken.
That I'd had a long day and got confused. But you knew what you saw. Yes, but I was 24 years old, a civilian clerk in a military facility. Who would believe me over official records? She wiped her eyes. I've carried that guilt for 2 years. If I'd insisted, if I'd pushed harder, maybe they would have searched for him. Maybe they would have found him in time. I took her hand gently. Morrison and Chen were already gone by the time you could have done anything. But your testimony helped the Army build their case against the men responsible. You did help him, just not in the way you thought. She seemed to find some comfort in that. But Dorothy's letter was just the first. Over the next 6 months, I received 8 more letters from people who'd worked at the depot between 1945 and 1946. A truck driver wrote that he'd seen 2 figures walking the fence line together late one night in March 1946. He'd assumed they were guards, but when he mentioned it the next day, he was told only one guard had been on duty that night. A maintenance worker described hearing voices speaking in the empty warehouses. One voice urgent and concerned, another calm and reassuring. He'd searched for the source but never found anyone. Most striking was a letter from a night supervisor named Patrick O'Brien. He'd worked at the depot from November 1945 to June 1946. I saw them constantly, he wrote. 2 soldiers, always together, walking patrols that no one had assigned them. At first I thought they were new hires who hadn't checked in properly. But they never responded when I called out. They'd just continue their rounds, checking doors, scanning the perimeter, doing their duty. I asked other supervisors about them. No one knew who I was talking about. After a while, I stopped mentioning it. But I knew what I was seeing. Those men were protecting that depot more faithfully than any of us who were actually on the payroll. I compiled all these accounts and brought them to Captain Wesley. He had been promoted and transferred to a desk job in D.C., but he'd remained interested in the case. "Fascinating," he said, reading through the letters. "You know what strikes me? No one reported feeling threatened or frightened. They all described these figures as protective, vigilant, like guardians." "That's exactly what they were," I said. "Morrison and Chen died trying to stop an injustice. Their spirits stayed to make sure their story didn't stay buried forever." Wesley leaned back in his chair. "I'm not a religious man, and I've certainly never believed in ghosts. But I've been in the military for 20 years, and I've learned that some bonds between soldiers transcend normal understanding. What you and your colleagues experienced, what all these witnesses describe, It's consistent with men who refuse to abandon their post, even in death. After the memorial was erected in December 1947, the sightings stopped. Every single person who'd reported seeing the two figures wrote to tell me the same thing. After the dedication ceremony, the depot grounds felt different, quieter, at peace. Tommy's mother told me something profound at the memorial dedication. She'd brought flowers, white chrysanthemums, which in Japanese culture honor the deceased. "My son and Mr. Morrison, they are together now," she said. "Not as soldiers, not as Japanese or American, just as brothers. The war separated so many, caused so much pain. But these two, they found unity in the worst moment. That is their gift to us." She was right. In death, Morrison and Chen had done what they couldn't do in life. They'd shown people that the real enemy was never each other. It was the hate, the prejudice, the inability to see the humanity in those who looked different from us. 30 years passed. It was 1976,
and I was 53 years old, retired from security work and living quietly in Seattle. I hadn't thought about the depot in years. Life moves on, memories fade, and the extraordinary becomes just another story you tell at dinner parties. Then I received a phone call that changed everything. "Is this the man who found James Morrison?" a young voice asked. "Yes, who's calling?" "My name is David Morrison. James was my uncle. I never met him. He passed away before I was born. But my grandmother Margaret just died, and in her belongings I found letters. Letters about you and what happened in 1946. We met the following week at a coffee shop in downtown Seattle. David was 25, studying history at the University of Washington. He had his uncle's eyes, kind and determined. "Grandma Margaret never remarried," he told me. "She said she'd had her great love, and one was enough for a lifetime. But she kept everything about Uncle Jimmy, letters, photos, newspaper clippings about the investigation. She made me promise that when she was gone, I'd make sure his story was remembered." He pulled out a folder. Inside were photographs I'd never seen. Jimmy Morrison as a child, as a teenager, in his army uniform before shipping overseas. But one photo stopped me cold. It showed Jimmy standing with another soldier, both in combat gear, somewhere in Italy. The other soldier was Asian American, wearing the same uniform, same determined expression. "Do you know who this is?" I asked, pointing to the second soldier. "That's what I was hoping you could tell me. It was tucked in with Uncle Jimmy's letters from Italy. No name on the back." My hands were shaking. When was this taken? According to Grandma's notes, summer of 1944, Monte Cassino campaign. I stared at the photo. The man standing next to Jimmy Morrison looked exactly like Robert Chen. Same build, same facial features. But Robert Chen had been in the Pacific Theater, and this photo was from Italy.
"I need to make a call," I said. I tracked down Tommy Chen, who was now running a community center in San Francisco. When I described the photo, there was a long silence on the line. "That's impossible," Tommy finally said. "Bobby served with the 442nd Regimental Combat Team in Europe, but he would have been in France, not Italy. The 442nd didn't fight at Monte Cassino." "Tommy, I'm looking at this photo right now. This soldier looks exactly like your brother." Another pause. There were some detachments, small units sent to support other divisions. Bobby never talked much about his service. My parents said he was ashamed that he was fighting for a country that had imprisoned his family. "Can you find out if he was at Monte Cassino?" 2 weeks later, Tommy called back. He'd gone through official records, tracked down veterans from Bobby's unit, pulled every string he could. "You were right," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "Bobby was at Monte Cassino. Temporary assignment as a translator. He spoke Italian, learned it from neighbors in San Francisco before the war. He was there for 6 weeks in the summer of 1944. Then he knew Morrison. They served together. Not just served together, Tommy corrected. I found a veteran who remembered them. He said Morrison saved Bobby's life during a German counterattack. Bobby was pinned down, wounded, and Morrison ran through enemy fire to pull him out. They were inseparable after that. The pieces fell into place with stunning clarity. James Morrison hadn't tried to help a stranger that night at the depot. He'd tried to help his friend, his brother in arms, a man who'd saved his life and whose life he'd saved in return. That's why Morrison's spirit had walked those grounds for a year. He wasn't just seeking justice, he was keeping watch over his fallen friend, refusing to let Bobby Chen be forgotten twice. Once in the internment camps, and again in an unmarked grave. Armed with this new information, David Morrison and I decided to return to the old depot site. The facility had been decommissioned in 1950 and sold to private developers. By 1976, it was an industrial park with warehouses and small factories. But the forest was still there, and so was the memorial. We found it on a gray November afternoon, exactly 30 years after we'd discovered the graves. The stone marker was weathered but intact, the inscription still readable. Someone had placed fresh flowers there recently, white chrysanthemums. People still remember, David said quietly. Some stories don't die, I replied. As we stood there, an elderly Asian woman approached, carrying more flowers. She stopped when she saw us, then smiled gently. "You are here for them too," she said. It wasn't a question. "Yes, ma'am." "Did you know them?" "Robert Chen was my cousin. I come here every year on the anniversary." She placed her flowers carefully at the base of the memorial. Our family was scattered after the war. Some stayed angry. Some tried to forget. But I remember Bobby as a hero. Him and his friend, James. They knew each other, I told her. They served together in Italy. They were brothers before they died together. Her eyes widened. We never knew that. The army said they were strangers, that James tried to help someone he'd never met. That's what we all thought, but we were wrong. They'd saved each other's lives overseas. That bond didn't end when they came home. She began to cry softly. That makes it even more beautiful, doesn't it? Even more tragic. They survived the war, survived everything, only to fall to the same hatred here at home. David and I stayed with her until sunset, sharing stories, piecing together the full narrative of that October night in 1945. As darkness fell, something extraordinary happened. The three of us saw them, just for a moment, just at the edge of vision. Two figures standing at the forest line, exactly where they'd appeared 30 years ago. But they weren't in uniform this time. They were in civilian clothes, and they were smiling. The elderly woman gasped. "Bobby," she whispered. They raised their hands, not a military salute, but a simple wave, a gesture of farewell and peace. Then they were gone. "Did you see them?" she asked. "Yes," David and I said together. She smiled through her tears. "Good. That means I'm not crazy. That means they really are at peace." The story spread after that 1976 visit. David Morrison wrote his master's thesis on the incident, documenting everything we'd discovered. The paper was published in a military history journal, and suddenly, James Morrison and Robert Chen were no longer forgotten footnotes. Veterans groups picked up the story. The Japanese American Citizens League honored both men posthumously. The Army issued a formal apology and upgraded Robert Chen's burial to a full military honor at a national cemetery. Margaret Morrison, though gone, was recognized for keeping her fiancé's memory alive.
But the most important impact was quieter, more personal. I started receiving letters again, not from witnesses this time, but from families. Children and grandchildren of men who'd served, who'd come home carrying guilt and secrets and trauma. One letter stands out. It was from the daughter of one of the men who'd been charged in Morrison and Chen's deaths. She wrote, "My father never spoke about what happened that night. He went to prison, served his time, and came home a broken man. He drank himself to death when I was 12. I grew up hating him, not knowing why he'd thrown his life away. But reading about Morrison and Chen, I finally understand. My father made a terrible choice, and it destroyed him. He couldn't live with what he'd done. Your story didn't excuse him, nothing can. But it helped me understand the weight he carried. Thank you for that." That's when I truly understood the purpose of what we'd experienced.
Morrison and Chen's spirits hadn't walked those depot grounds seeking revenge or punishment. They'd walked seeking truth, seeking acknowledgement, seeking to ensure that their sacrifice, and the sacrifices of all those who came home changed by war, would be remembered and understood. Frank passed away in 1982. At his funeral, his former students spoke about the stories he'd told them, about courage and friendship, and standing up for what's right, even when it costs everything. Tommy lived until 2005. He spent his final years working with veterans suffering from PTSD, helping them understand that trauma doesn't make you weak, it makes you human. As for me, I'm 93 now, telling this story one last time. In a few weeks, there will be a ceremony at the site. The industrial park is being redeveloped, and the new owners are creating a memorial park around the original stone marker. Morrison and Chen will finally have the recognition they deserve. David Morrison, now in his 70s, will be there. So will Robert Chen's extended family. And so will I, if my health holds. The Memorial Park dedication ceremony took place on October 15, 2019, 73 years to the day after we first saw James Morrison's spirit walking the depot grounds. I made it to the ceremony, though I needed a wheelchair and my grandson's help. David Morrison was there, now 73 himself, with his own grandchildren. The Chen family came from across the country, over 40 people, all descendants of Robert's siblings. The new memorial was beautiful. A curved granite wall with both men's photographs etched into the stone, along with their service records and a detailed account of what happened that October night in 1945. But what moved me most was the inscription at the base. They stood together when it mattered most. Their friendship transcended war, prejudice, and even death itself. May we remember their courage and follow their example. During the ceremony, a historian from the National World War II Museum spoke about the broader context, the 442nd Regimental Combat Team, the internment camps, the struggles soldiers faced returning home to a country that didn't always welcome them. Morrison and Chen represent two sides of the same American story, she said. One man fought to liberate Europe while his friend's family was imprisoned here at home. Yet they found brotherhood on the battlefield and maintained it until the very end. Their story reminds us that the ideals we fought for abroad must also be lived at home. After the official ceremony ended, something remarkable happened. A park ranger approached me with a nervous expression. "Sir, I need to tell you something. I've been the caretaker here for 3 years, and I've seen them. The two soldiers. Not often, maybe 3 or 4 times. Always around dawn, always walking together near where the old forest begins. I thought I was seeing things, but after today, after hearing the full story..." "You're not seeing things," I assured him. "They still visit sometimes, checking in, making sure their story is being told right." He looked relieved. "So I'm not crazy?"
no more than I was in 1946. That evening, as the sun set and most people had left, I asked my grandson to wheel me to the forest edge, to the exact spot where we'd first followed Morrison into the trees 73 years ago. The forest had changed, thinner now, encroached upon by development. But some of the old trees remained, silent witnesses to everything that had happened. I sat there in my wheelchair, an old man at the end of his life, and I spoke to the gathering darkness. Jimmy, Bobby, if you're listening, thank you. Thank you for trusting us with your story. Thank you for showing 3 young veterans that some bonds survive everything, even death. Your watch is over now. You can rest. The air grew still. The temperature dropped slightly. And just for a moment,
I felt 2 hands rest gently on my shoulders, one on the left, one on the right. Warm, real, comforting. Then they were gone. My grandson noticed my tears. "Grandpa, are you okay?" "I'm fine," I said. "Better than fine. I just said goodbye to 2 old friends." I'm 93 years old now, and I've told this story hundreds of times over the decades. Each time, people ask me the same questions. Do you really believe you saw ghosts? Were Morrison and Chen really there? Or was it grief and exhaustion playing tricks? How can you be sure it wasn't just your imagination? Here's what I know. 3 men saw the same figure on 4 consecutive nights. We followed him to a location we had no reason to search. We found 2 bodies that had been missing for over a year. Everything we discovered was verified by military investigators. The timeline, the confrontation, the cover-up. All real, all documented. The rest? Whether Morrison's spirit actually walked those grounds or whether 3 traumatized veterans somehow intuited where to look, does it really matter? What matters is that 2 men who deserved to be remembered were finally found. 2 families received closure, and a terrible injustice was brought to light. Frank used to say that the supernatural elements weren't the point. The point was that Morrison and Chen's friendship was so strong, their bond so deep, that nothing could completely erase them. Not hate, not death, not even deliberate attempts to make them disappear. They refused to be forgotten, Frank would say. And that's the most powerful force in the universe, the refusal to let injustice have the final word. I've spent 73 years thinking about those October nights, about what we saw, what it meant, what it taught me. And I've come to understand something profound. We all become ghosts in a way. The question is, what kind of ghost will you be? Will you be the kind that haunts with malice, that spreads pain and fear? Or will you be the kind that Morrison and Chen were, spirits who protect, who guide, who refuse to let truth stay buried? Every person leaves an impression on the world. The good we do, the stands we take, the friendships we honor, these things echo forward through time. They influence people we'll never meet in ways we'll never know. James Morrison could have walked past Robert Chen that night, could have decided it wasn't his problem, that he'd done his part in the war and earned the right to look away. Robert Chen could have backed down, apologized, tried to make himself smaller to survive. Neither man took the easy path, and their choice, to stand together, to refuse to accept injustice, cost them everything. But it also created a legacy that has touched thousands of lives over 7 decades. The young park ranger who sees them occasionally, he started a program bringing together veterans from different eras, different conflicts, different backgrounds. He says Morrison and Chen inspired it. David Morrison's grandchildren? They volunteer with refugee resettlement organizations. They say their great-great-uncle taught them that you stand up for people, even strangers, especially when it's dangerous. The Chen family? They've established a scholarship for Japanese-American students studying conflict resolution and social justice.
All of this from two men who died on a forgotten night in 1945, who might have stayed buried and forgotten if they hadn't refused to let their story end in that shallow grave. So when people ask me if I really saw ghosts, I tell them this. I saw two soldiers who loved their country enough to die for it, loved each other enough to die together, and loved justice enough to make sure their deaths meant something. Call that what you want. I call it the best of what humanity can be. I'm telling you this story now because I won't be here much longer. My health is failing, and I know I'm in my final chapter. But before I go, I needed to make sure this story was preserved one more time. Because Morrison and Chen are still teaching us, still showing us that friendship transcends all boundaries, that courage means standing up when it would be easier to walk away, that death doesn't have to be the end if we remember, if we honor, if we carry forward the truth. The fourth guard wasn't a ghost. It was a reminder that we're never truly alone, that those who came before us watch over us still, that the bonds we forge in life can survive even death itself. Thank you for listening. Remember James Morrison. Remember Robert Chen. And remember that every day you have the choice to be someone worth remembering. This concludes The Fourth Guard. May we all have friends who would walk through darkness for us. And may we be friends worthy of that loyalty. Rest in peace, Jimmy and Bobby. Your watch is over. Your story lives on.